Great. Okay, so my name is Clara Kliman Silver. As Sarah mentioned, I am a UX researcher at Google, and I work on the material design team, which is Google's design system. Um, and I'm on Twitter. I'll share out some of the links that I have up here at the end, but feel free to reach out or tweet at me as we go. So thank you to Optimal Workshop and all for having me today. And I'll begin by telling you a little bit about my journey to UX, and then we'll get into the heart of the talk. So I went to University for Cognitive Science, where I studied how people learn about information, how they make decisions, how they learn languages. And it was a focus a lot on theory, but it was actually a really good preparation for a career in UX research. I think that it taught me a lot of the critical skills around how do you do research, how do you think about data. Um, After I graduated, I got a job at a healthcare firm where we were working on tooling for doctors and medical professionals to help them diagnose patients and to help them um, prescribe medications and do other critical healthcare tasks. And then I moved actually out to California to work at an artificial intelligence firm where we were making tools for developers and to help them build AI. And then about 4 years ago, I went over to Google to work on design systems and tools. So I've actually spent a lot of my career working on productivity and tooling workflows and thinking about how we can use technology to help people build better products and focus on what they want to do. So obviously the last couple of years have been an interesting time to work in, well, to work in general, but especially to work in tooling and productivity. I think the way that we work is changing, obviously partly due to COVID and the fact that many people have transitioned to remote work. But I think also the design tools, developer tools, and design system space is very dynamic. Um, a lot of these tools and resources that we use have changed considerably over the last 5 to 10 years. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but also when we should be talking less about tools and more about process or how people work together, and where you might be going, and then how you can take some of the methods that we've used home to your teams or to the populations you study as UXers, and learn more about how to work more effectively. So I was going to do a show of hands. I don't know if I can do that. So if not, just raise your hand in your head or on your own. When I get this talk, I like to get a sense of familiarity of design systems. So I'm curious how many people have used a design system or worked on a design system. And I guess I can't really see that, but yeah, some of you have for sure. Great. Thank you for raising your hands with the emojis. And then how many folks have heard of material design? Great. So we've had a good mix here. I'll go over some basics and then we can get into it. So at Google, I work on material design. Material is Google's design system. So it's probably something you've seen if you use a Google product. For example, if you open Gmail or Google Maps, you might notice that even though they're very different things, they have some of the same elements, some of the same colors, maybe some of the same buttons or text fields. So that's the design system at work. But the material system is also available to everyone. If you go to material.io, you can go there and find components. So sort of little bits of UI that interact together to make patterns and interactive guidelines. You can find guidance about how to build a design, how to work with accessibility. And then you can find icons, typographic information, and tooling to understand your designs better. So it's a collection of design resources. And what it means in practice is that anytime you use an app bar or a button, an icon, a link style, or anything that's that makes up your design, it's the same everywhere. So that's the beauty of the design system. There's a clear benefit to users. It ensures that anybody who comes to your product or your suite of products knows what to expect. Every time they see a button, they know what it is and how it's going to behave. But there's also a benefit to the people who make the app or to make your product, because it enables some consistency for them as well. So a couple of years ago, some of the researchers on my team did a really interesting study about how you adopt design systems and the value of adopting design systems. Um, so they interviewed a bunch of designers who use design systems, and they asked them what the process was like. And they found that everybody who adopted a design system could point to a common language. So when you talk about, say, your primary link color, everyone knows what that means. When you refer to a certain component or a certain pattern, that meaning is understood as well. Eventually, this results in generating shared artifacts. Maybe you have a design file, maybe you have a deck, maybe you have documentation or some kind of shared code library. Um, this in turn means that there's common tooling. So maybe you all agree to use a certain tool or a certain set of tools because it makes your work easier. And through defining all of these common touch points, you start to engender a common culture. So while a design system makes it easier to build a product, it also changes how your team works together, hopefully in a positive way. So then they wanted to dive into the value. They asked, why did you adopt a design system, and what were the benefits or the drawbacks that you saw after you did that? And there are a couple of clear benefits that we talked about. Standardization of patterns and visual elements, making sure that products are consistent for end users. But so that's the product and the process pieces at the top of this diagram. But there are a couple of additional things that they uncovered as well. One is team health. So thinking about how a system or a design tool relates to relationships and alignment. One research participant told us that after adopting a design system, the team actually spent less time churning and debating decisions, which led to more positive interactions within the team. It also improved processes and tooling, and then that led to increased job satisfaction. So people were actually happier about working and about building their products because these interactions were pleasant, and in many ways it was easier for them to do their work. So while there's a clear impact on the product, the value that they're getting from the design system is holistic in that it is impacting how people work together, creating a shared culture and a richer experience as product people. So I think when we talk about design systems, and as I'll get into in a moment, design tools, we tend to focus very much on the artifacts that we're using to build a product. And that's great, but I want to also talk about the people. When I think about this idea I call design ecosystems, I'm thinking about the combination of systems, of tools, and the people who are working together to use them. A design system itself can shape the ecosystem and it creates the structure and support, but the systems and the tools don't define the design process alone. They work together holistically as part of this greater ecosystem that involve the people and the processes that they evolve. So the rest of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about tools and why design tools are a hot topic, but they're not the only answer to product problems, and how you can study these ecosystems yourself in your own work and hopefully make for better collaboration. All right, so most of my work these days focuses on design tools. And I think tools are interesting because they're, as I mentioned, a really hot topic right now. If you go on Twitter or other design spaces, you often see people debating which design tool is best, which one's their favorite. People create new tools all the time that are all super cool. Lots of interesting things that are going on. Yeah, like I saw someone commented Figma, and Figma has definitely taken off. And I think a lot of people have responded to it in really interesting ways. So there's definitely a culture and infrastructure around design tools that have emerged. But I also sometimes think that we focus too much on the tools, and as I said, not on some of the factors that that influence how we work together. In addition, like the way people work together. So I want to share a couple of insights from the research that we've done and what this means for collaboration. So when I started working on design tools almost 4 years ago, I kept hearing this refrain that there were too many tools. Too many tools out there. We need a perfect tool. Exactly. Microsoft Paint is a good tool, but like lots and lots of tools that people are using to create things, and we just need one. Let's just get rid of all the tools. And I heard that a lot, and then I started to hear this perspective too, one designer interviewed told me, the least amount of tools that my teammates have to look at, the better. So what this said to me was not that they need to, like the designer needs to have a single tool, or even the teammates need to have a single tool, but rather the designer can use as many tools as they want. But if the teammates know where to go, sort of what that source of truth is for the product, that is better. Um, and that's sort of the optimal state that they want to get to. And as I dove into this, I started to hear this refrain more and more from different people in different contexts. The pathways or the interactions between the tools, the way that they integrate with one another, is more important than the tools themselves. So if your tools can share data, let's say that you're creating an animation and you're working in a design tool, but or you want to work in a design tool as well, but your design tool doesn't do this advanced animation. Being able to import the animation into the design tool is fine for a lot of people. They'd rather work with two tools they know really well and just have that easy shared integration rather than like have to learn a third tool that they don't know that can do everything. So I think there's a lot of flexibility here. And especially when you're talking about large distributed teams, this is very important to keep in mind. So in 2019, pre-pandemic, we ran a survey with 600 UXers around the world. We asked them about the tools they used, why they used them. And we heard about 150 different tools, which was a lot more than I expected. And what was interesting here is that we asked people pretty broad questions like, what are tools that you use for your UX work? And we heard about tools that I wouldn't consider traditional UX tools. Like we heard about tools for creating presentations or tools for writing documentation. One use case that people brought up a lot was that the designers using one tool and the developers on their team don't use that tool or don't like it. So the designers create a presentation to explain their design decisions and sort of the design theory. And while this was great, this worked out for everyone and create a shared document that everybody could look at and sort of understand together. It did introduce another surface into the ecosystem that then had to be maintained. So sometimes, so maybe this is where you start to see that like a tooling problem also can engender a process problem, or a solution to a tooling problem might be a new process. So quite nuanced there. We also asked them what motivates you to use a certain tool. And in this case, you can see, I'm gonna try to see if I can, like looking at my thing in a really small window. Hang on. Is there, okay. Anyway, I was trying to indicate something on the screen, but I don't know if you can see it. So never mind. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so you can see up here, the 43% number, that many of our respondents were using tools because their teammates were using them. So while it was really exciting that a new tool might be exciting, it might be on the market, or it might be a tool that you have experience with from a previous company, sometimes it's just easier to use something because that's what everybody else in your space uses. Prior experience obviously does make it easier to ramp up. If you know how to use something, why spend your time trying to learn something new if you can do something really quickly in the tools you're familiar with? But also a lot of UX tools are expensive. So sometimes it's the most affordable, the tool that you pick is the most affordable option, and that's what you have to go with. And some of the time you're working with a niche use case, or you're working with a client and they have specific security needs, something like that. And there might only be one tool that you can use. And that's also a fairly common use case. So what this showed us was that even though people can be very, people have a lot of opinions about tools and they can be very dedicated to specific tools, there's often a lot of extenuating circumstances that drive what people choose to adopt or not. And there's, people end up being very creative about the tools they use. Like you might use a presentation tool to create designs, or you might use a design tool to do research, and you really just have to figure out what works for your context. When we dove into this a little bit further, we heard that despite this sort of yearning for an all-in-one tool, there were often a lot of factors that ended up driving tool choices, and often you just had to pick something that worked for your scenario. Maybe you had multiple scenarios depending on who you're working with, who your clients were, or the size of your team. I think a lot of people are still in pursuit of this, sort of that all-in-one tool. But really what I do feel is at the heart of this quote, I want an all-in-one solution so that I don't have to switch between too many tools or lose track of which information where which information can be found. I think at the heart of this is really establishing that single source of truth. Um, Back to that first designer, I want my teammates to know where to look. What is the place that you're going to refer to, or you want your teammates to refer to when you create a design or a deliverable that you know is the most up-to-date one? And if everybody knows what that is, then that saves a lot of time. The other thing that's come on the rise a lot, and I think for the folks who are commenting Figma is a really good example of this. There are lots of things that people want tools to do that they don't do, or sometimes it can be hard to get tools to talk to each other. So plugins can be a really good bridge. We've seen tons and tons of plugins emerge over the last couple of years to do anything you could imagine to make the design process and research process and development processes easier. So interconnectivity of tools, especially as tools continue to proliferate, has become increasingly important, and I suspect we'll see more of that in the future. So the last finding that I'll call out from 2019 was that about half of the respondents used a collaborative tool to create designs. So again, this is 2019, this was pre-pandemic, but a lot of people were still collaborating on design tools. A lot of people were still doing things in like their own files and then sharing them around. So I think that speaks to where we were then and the fact that these tools are still really important, even though we're not working in the distributed world that we are today. We ran the survey again last year, and we heard about even more tools, which speaks to the fact that even though I think in some places we're starting to see a focus on certain tools, or people are coalescing or maybe around Figma or around certain research tools or writing tools or whatnot, there's always new things coming out and people are doing interesting things with them. So again, why it can be hard to look for that one size fits all solution. But the other thing that I thought was interesting and maybe not unexpected is that the real-time numbers shot way up. And most participants for this survey in 2021 were now working in these collaborative design tools. And I expect, again, that this is a trend that we'll continue to see in the future. More and more things need to be real-time collaborative. More and more things need to work across time zones, across locations, and really thinking about what can you do when you can't all be in the same room. Individual preferences still matter though. And we asked that question again about why do you use your tool? We saw a lot of different answers. A lot of people commented on specific scenarios that started to emerge, like, we're all collaborating in this thing, but sometimes I just want to do something by myself. So how do I indicate to people that this is what I want reviewed and this is not? And I think this raises a question about the availability of a tool or the existence of a tool versus the intention of a tool and how that might differ from user to user. And a new point that I started to see in 2021 that I hadn't seen as much in 2019 is creating team norms around tools. How do we as a group, or we as people who are collaborating together, agree to use this tool or use a set of tools? More of that sort of design ecosystem culture point that we were talking about earlier. And again, I think in a distributed world, that also becomes very critical. I think though, in general, a lot of the categories we talked about previously, like cost, availability, prior experience, they all continue to matter. And a lot of that didn't really shift. One question I like to ask in interviews with designers is, where is the latest design? And everything on the screen, slide decks, chat, docs, email, prototypes, code, design tools, bugs, whiteboards, meetings, photos, are all valid answers and all different things that people have told me over the years. Often I hear that it's in someone's head as well, whether that's the designer's head or the PM's head or the client's head. But there are a lot of things that vary. So the problem here might be about too many tools, but it's often that when you have a lot of tools, you spawn a lot of artifacts, and that unlocks the possibility for many sources of truth. And if you don't all know what that source of truth is, then it can get very confusing. And this to me sticks out as the thing that really says, these aren't tooling problems. These are process problems. Um, Real-time collaboration tools don't necessarily make this any easier. And this is a point where I think individuals and teams really need to take a concentrated look at what they have and how they want to work together. And I think when teams define these design system cultures, this ends up being a point that they arrive at quickly and then need to iterate around to establish the norms. Really, as we look at this research, coordination is repeatedly the biggest pain point. Coordination meaning I mean, any kind of process, but especially how are you making decisions together? Where is the design decision? What is the design decision? Who makes, like, who gets to decide? How are you logging those decisions? What is your source of truth? All those kinds of things. And again, I think when you can't be in the same room and when you may be in different time zones, working out of different tools, then this becomes very, very critical. So I think as we think about the tools that we use and why we use them, establishing these norms and agreeing on them with your teams and your collaborators is maybe the best thing that we can do. And the solution will continue to be context dependent. So one of the last things that I'll talk about before we move into questions is this activity that we did actually first as a research method, but then it turned out it was a really handy retro method. So depending on who you do research on or do design work for, develop for, write for, then you can use this either to study your users or you can use it to think about your own team's work. So this is an activity that you can do with your whole team. It works virtually as well as in person. It's set up as a workshop, and I usually run it in about 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on the size of the team, but you can split it up over multiple sessions. It's totally fine to break it up that way. So it begins with this prompt to think about a typical project. So UX project, product project, whatever you do at work. And then we ask everyone to think about a couple questions. What did you do first? What did you do last? What were the steps in between? Whom did you work with? And which tools did you use? So then there were 3 tasks. And the first task was to ask users or participants to start by defining their initial workflows. So we gave everybody sheets of paper. You can use a virtual whiteboarding tool, whatever you want. But ask them to take a few minutes to just sketch out, what do you do? What are the steps of your workflow? So for someone, it might be ideation and then sketching and then iterations and feedback and then some kind of formal user research. For others, it might be like do research on code or check out like the common strings or something for if you're a writer. But basically, this gets people in the right mindset and helps them think about the tools that they use, the processes they follow, and so on. Also, I think one of the critical things here is that not everybody if you're doing this your whole team, not everybody is super comfortable getting up in front of a whiteboard and drawing pictures. So having people do something on their own first can be a really good way to ease into the activity, get them thinking about their workflow in a piecewise fashion, and then sets them up for the next activity, which is putting it together as a team. So after everyone has done their individual bit, we brought everyone together to map out their team workflow. So across the top of this chart, you have phases, which are helpfully numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But they can also be, or ideally, they're also going to be things like ideation and alignment and feedback and handoff and so on. Most of the teams that we did this with usually landed on between 5 and 7, but I've seen a lot more depending on the complexity of the project. Down the other column or down the rows, you have the roles. So these are people on your team. You can set this up however you like, depending on who's on your team or how many of each type you have. But you'll create a grid like this, and then everyone starts going in and filling in the tasks. So these are Post-it notes. And again, you can do this virtually if you want, but you'll write, everybody writes the task they're doing on a given phase on the Post-it notes. And then you can look at, when you do this, you look at like, what are people doing during different phases? Are your teammates doing what you think they're doing or what you thought they were doing? Are there surprises here? maybe there's a part of the workflow that no one is actually addressing, and that's a problem. Maybe there's multiple people working on the same thing, and that's actually super counterproductive. So it's a really good way to get that 10,000-foot view of how do you work together and start to see some of the places where things might be going really well and where things might need improvement. Then we had everyone go back and do the same thing with tools. So for certain tasks, what tools are you using? Can be interesting to see whether you're using the same tool for your multiple tasks or whether you're using multiple tools for the same task. Maybe there's a task that doesn't have a good tool for it, which again might be a signal that there's a problem. But the idea of putting this together is it allows the teams to see what might be missing and start to identify the pain points, which is the last part. So we had people rate their pain with these little red dots on a scale of 1 to 5. So gave everybody a couple of dots and said, put them wherever you want, whatever causes the most pain for you. Label it 1 to 5, 1 being mildly annoying and 5 being extremely frustrating, and sort of have at it. What we found is that people sometimes found a task frustrating, sometimes a tool frustrating. Often they would put it on blank spots, so you can sort of see that in the middle. There are some places that no one was doing something, and that in and of itself was a problem. Or alternatively, maybe there was a role missing. Somebody wasn't doing, there wasn't someone to do a certain job, and that in and of itself was an issue. So the nice thing here is that you're breaking it down from different vantage points, so you can see whether the pain is a tool or a task or something else, or a moment, and then you can figure out how to address it. So some here, the benefits of the approach, looking at your process from roles, teams, and sort of different perspectives. Slice and dice phases, tasks, roles, and tools. So being able to examine how do you use this tool, or how do you get this thing done, and what are the pain points? And then this is almost in some ways like a contextual inquiry. By doing an immersive experience, you're able to observe how teams collaborate or how your team collaborates, and really how people talk about their experiences. So I think this has been a really revealing way both to reflect on the work that my team does and how we work together, as well as to study our users. So definitely a reminder that this is something that you can do yourself, either for your user base or for your own team, and think about ways that we can improve our work. I think one thing I've seen teams do successfully here as a way to track changes is they'll run this. They'll decide to try a couple of different things. Maybe they change a process, they introduce a new tool, and then they run this again 6 months later and see if the pain points have moved. So a good reflection activity. And I'll write this up so that people can see what the process looks like. All right, last thing. So one thing I get really excited about is also thinking about where the industry is headed and sort of how tools are likely to change in the future. I know I mentioned this a little bit already around remote tooling and enabling collaboration, but I also think automation is a super interesting topic. So one of my team's major questions as we look across the field is the role of artificial intelligence in the design process. So there have been a lot of industry-wide conversations over the last couple of years about automation and productivity. So thinking about things like smart reply in Gmail or autocomplete in developer tools. And in many of these cases, artificial intelligence is embraced. It's an accelerant. It helps users avoid tedious tasks. But the role of AI in design is still emerging. I think we've started to see auto layout a little bit in commercial product design tools, but best practices are still emerging. And I think it's worth thinking about what this might look like in the future. A couple of years ago, my team wrote a paper where we tried to classify different types of AI-driven experiences. So thinking about things like chatbots or personal robots or a smart camera, so camera on a smartphone. And we thought about 3 different dimensions. The first dimension, the white one, is independence. So that's thinking about how much does AI act on its own. You can think about a helper robot that sort of perceives user intent. So that might be very independent versus a recommender system that provides suggestions based on user input. Another dimension is discretion, which is the extent to which a user needs to opt in. So thinking about things like smart cameras. If you hold up your phone, take a picture, it might say move closer to the subject or move into better lighting or something like that. But that's not something that you as a user are obligated to act on. That's discretionary. And then the last dimension is this dimension of social personal. Sometimes an AI-driven experience is very personalized. You're using an application on your phone, and the impact is primarily on your experience with that application or its output. But sometimes you have AI in these larger contexts, users communicating online with customized social media experiences, for instance. So I think while we're looking at this through a broader lens and thinking about how dimensions are meant to classify general AI-driven experiences, they extend to tooling, I think. So thinking about like, how do designers want to personalize a tool based on their style? When might they benefit from best practices? And then also, how much independence do they want? What should an AI do, and what should an AI not do? One specific read on this that we've been thinking about is the balance of efficiency and agency. So you can see on the left here, you might want to avoid making lots of versions of the same thing. So people have, in some of the research that I've read, designers emphasize wanting to automate making lots of versions of something with slight modifications. Just speed that up for me. I don't want to do that tedious work myself. But on the other hand, there's this concern about like giving up too much control to the AI. One designer told me that I interviewed told me that they were worried about smart tools that would make mistakes that they would then have to fix because the tools misunderstood what they intended. And then you have to ask, like, is it really more efficient if you have to spend time correcting an assistant? That doesn't really speed you up. So the balance of efficiency and agency is something that future tools will need to be striking and thinking about. I've sort of imagined that these dimensions could be levers that designers would pull to identify how much assistance they want. But again, this is still very much an emerging space, and would love to talk to other folks who are thinking about this. One quick real-time example. So there's a tool on material.io called the Theme Builder, where you input an image and you get a dynamic or accessible color palette out of it. So we ran a study where we asked designers to try it out, and a lot of them told us that they wanted to understand what the tool was doing and how it was making these decisions, to the extent they would actually rather do more manual work in curating the color palettes because they weren't sure how much they could trust the output, given that it was magical. And I think some people, really want creative control. They're sort of unwilling to give that up to a system. So I think this is a good example of that balance between automation and agency. Automation isn't enough if users don't feel like they can trust AI. And it can also be really valuable to have a sort of final say or review any decisions or changes or recommendations that AI proposes. So again, I think this is an emerging space, and new paradigms and attitudes will continue to emerge, and we'll want to monitor them and figure out best practices from there. If you're interested in this, I would recommend checking out the PAIR guidebook. This is a resource that Google put out that is compiled by researchers, designers, developers, and AI experts across the company who share best practices for designing with AI and developing with it as well. And there are some sections on explainability and trust and how to measure user trust as it pertains to AI. So I'll include this in the list of links. So in sum, we do believe that it's possible to bring AI into the design process, but in a limited and focused way. Lots of research has uncovered AI as a corrective function, as well as a vehicle for discovery. But of course, with the guardrails of allowing users to maintain control and helping maintain trust. So if this is a space you're in or a space you're interested in, I would love to talk to you. Definitely reach out to me after this. So summing up before I turn over to questions, design systems and tools and people come together as an ecosystem. So thinking not fixating too much on tools or systems, but also on the ecosystems that we inhabit and how we build products together. thinking about whether something can really be solved with a new tool or whether a new process might be a better approach. Um, Thinking about doing workflow audits to understand, using that method to understand how you work together or how your users work together. And as we introduce automation in the future, which I think is definitely a big thing people are talking about right now, being careful and deliberate about how it's deployed. Thank you so much, and to all of you for your time today.